Segment I false start, they're just holes. Let's start with the popular shrug. They're just holes. Medieval folk dug odd places, end of story. Except, the labels are medieval but the excavated features are weirdly consistent. You see schlup-pinched throats where you must slide shoulders diagonal, sometimes with a slight flare that feels engineered. You see sitznischen, neat sit niches tucked off the main crawl, repeating at intervals that look like a rule, not a whim. And you find dead ends that don't behave like mistakes. They behave like valves, short, controlled branches that feel intentional. Dimensions repeat too, widths at 40-60 centimeters with low roof arcs that force the same movement pattern. The microslopes sit in that 1-3% band again and again, which turns a miserable scoot into a maintainable rhythm. If you've ever crawled a natural squeeze, you know nature isn't that considerate. These passages often are. Now the objections: too small for transport, no artifacts, dating control is poor. And yes, that's partly true. You're not walking a cart through here, you're pacing human bodies. You're not finding bronze hoards every 10 meters, and without hearths or timber, clean dates are tricky. But here's what the objections miss: standardization. When schlup cross-sections match within tight tolerances across hills, villages, and sometimes languages, that smells like serial production logic. Tool marks aren't random either. In several belts, you see rhythmic picks scarring with orientation that suggests coordinated teams working in relay, consistent swings, consistent spacing, like template work with human muscle. Then the acoustics. People love to roll their eyes at this, but do a simple test. A low-frequency knock carries through constrictions differently than a shout. In site after site, a soft hum finds a window where the passage hands it along. We'll log the sweeps later, but that cluster around 110 Hz, low, present, bodily, is real enough to put a meter on. This isn't mysticism, it's waveguide behavior in tight geometry. And the surface chemistry. In isolated cases, those polished throats aren't just smoothed by crawling. You find thin, glassy films, localized vitrification, right where pressure and contact concentrate. In Styria, there are reports of glossy faces in chokes from the 197s. In Bavaria, veterans recall polished throats under farms. Casual digging doesn't vitrify wall faces at a choke. Either heat, pressure, or a deliberate hardening pass change the surface where it matters most, where bodies squeeze, where signals focus. So are they too small for transport? For carts, yes. For human-scale conveyance, messaging, or concealed movement. The geometry argues the opposite. Are they empty of artifacts? Also, yes, if you expect domestic debris. But a transit device doesn't want clutter. It wants clearance, durability, and predictable behavior. Poor dating? Fair. But terminus post-quem can be triangulated. Overcuts from later cellars, backfill pollen, masonry intrusions that cap a passage. And reuse muddy's signals, wine storage here, root cellars there. But the core geometry under the retrofit often sits pristine, like an old machine left inside a newer shed. The punchline of the false start is simple. Just holes, collapses under 3 boring, stubborn facts, standardized parts, engineered wave behavior, and evidence of surface hardening right where forces concentrate. If you still think random peasants freelance their way to transnational copy-paste tunnels, with matching schlup repeating sitznischen on perfect crawl gradients, that also happen to pass a 110 Hz window, you're free to hold that, but we're going to test it like engineers. Because once we bring Bavaria's modular lengths into view, the pattern gets hard to ignore, and the story stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like manufacturing. Case Study 1, Lower Bavaria's Modular Tunnels. Okay, Bavaria. If there's a template, it lives under the Windberg-Deggendorf belt. The pattern starts showing up in the 197s when small renovations turned into controlled chaos. A farmer drops a slab in a grain cellar and slides into a passage that doesn't wander, it proceeds. The locals called them Schrazelach or just that old crawl. But when you put a tape on the wall, the romance drops out and the numbers start rhyming. Here's what we kept seeing. Straight runs that hold a length between roughly 3.2 and 3.5 meters, then a schlup choke, then another 3-ish meter run, then another choke. Segment, valve, like pipe modules with reducers. It isn't random. If it were, the segment lengths would drift with fatigue, rock quality, and whim. Instead, you can lay a measuring string along Deggendorf hillsides and watch it click through the same cadence. 3 and a bit pinch. 3 and a bit pinch. That's not people just digging, that's people repeating. Tool marks confirm the rhythm. In multiple cuts, the pick scars run on a bias, spaced so evenly you can count beats. 1, 2, 3, rotate, 1, 2, 3, rotate. The scar orientation doesn't spin wildly with each pocket of soil. It holds a preferred swing, like crews were trained to cut on a fixed angle so the throat forms to spec. We even get alternating bite depth, a shallow-deep-shallow pattern you'd expect from a two-person relay trying to maintain a ventilation cycle while cutting. It looks like team choreography, not weekend improvisation. And then the nodes. People assume these tunnels hover in nowhere. They don't. The densest clusters sit just off ridge spines, tucked under field margins that later hosted medieval freight tracks. When you overlay old road cadasters, the picture gets awkward. Later traffic sits on top of the high ground and the tunnels shadow beneath, as if some prototype routing already solved the floodplain problem long before carts and tolls. You also get proximity to monastic estates. Windberg's old sphere of control shows up more than chance would like. Was it reuse? Sponsorship? Or just that logistics always lands on the same bones of the land? Acoustics next, because in Bavaria it's embarrassingly repeatable. A whisper doesn't carry through a schlupf. A low knock does. In the 3-2-3, 5-meter runs, a soft hum near the low, a band wakes up the passage. At several test points, you sweep from 80 to 140 hertz and watch a meter jump around 110. The hum locks into the wall like a tuning fork and bleeds forward through the next choke. You don't need myth. You need waveguides in serial cavities. Once you feel that coupling, the schlup stops looking like an obstacle and starts looking like a valve. Pressure is part of it. Along the belt, we find little side pockets, call them pressure niches off the main runs. They don't store anything, they behave like vents. Crack a candle, feel the draw, watch a lighter flame lean across the throat during a temperature swing. Now put the two together. A segment of fixed length that supports a predictable resonance, a constriction that throttles both airflow and sound, and side niches that equalize pressure. It's a machine layout built from dirt. About that surface polish. In Lower Bavaria, local accounts talk about throats so slick you'd check your elbows for mud and see nothing on the wall. Polishing happens with bodies, sure. But in a few chokes, the surface isn't just smooth, it looks denser. Thin films that suggest either heat, pressure, or both, focusing exactly where stress and signal concentrate. We're not calling a full vitrification without lab work, but the observation lines up with Styria's glossy faces and the logic matches. If the choke is the valve, you harden the valve seat. Dating is the sticky part, so we triangulate. Overcuts from later farm cellars slice clean through some runs, terminus post-quem. Backfill samples hold pollen consistent with specific land use windows, another bracket. In one Windberg outlier, a medieval masonry wall caps a throat with a distinct mortar recipe. The tunnel is earlier than the wall. No, we don't get a single shiny year. We get ranges, and those ranges keep landing before the road overlays and before the heavy monastic refurb. One more uncomfortable point, labor. People hear hundreds of meters and picture armies. You don't need them. With short winter crews working on high ground during wet seasons, you can bite off a segment a week. 3 meters, choke, pressure pocket, repeat. The uniformity comes from a template and local training, not imperial levies. It's the modularity that saves you. Teams can stop and start without ruining the profile because the module defines itself. Now, why Bavaria matters beyond Bavaria. If the belt is a template, we should see copy-paste logic over language. That's the test we'll take into Styria and Bohemia. But already the Degendorf runs tell you the core truth. This isn't folk whim. It's repeatable geometry that behaves consistently in airflow, in sound, in human movement. You don't have to guess the purpose to recognize the pattern. The pattern announces itself like a metronome under the ground. And if you're thinking, could this just be a Bavarian quirk? Fair. So let's go where the ridge spine logic is almost textbook and where the glossy throats were actually written down. We cross a border, but the modules don't. Case study 2, Styria and Upper Austria, the ridge logic. We hop the border and the geometry doesn't blink. In Styria, the tunnels ride the high ground like they're allergic to damp. You can trace them along less capped ridges sitting comfortably above floodplains, almost as if the land itself told the builders, stay here if you want predictable behavior. When you walk the surface, you feel it. Clean spines, dry shoulders, and then at field margins or beneath a farmhouse step, an entry that never advertises itself. Concealment isn't theatrical, it's agricultural. Entrances tuck into the edges of plowland, behind stable walls, under chapels that arrived later and pretended they owned the spot. You drop in, and the pattern from Bavaria greets you like an old handshake. A short, straight run, a schlup throat you have to time with your breath, and then the relief of the next cavity. The micro slopes, same discipline. You keep finding that 1-3% gradient, enough to assist drainage and airflow, gentle enough to let a body high crawl without burning out. Fatigue falls into a rhythm, not a fight. Styria's ventilation geometry is the part most folks miss because it reads as decoration until you work the air. Ceiling cups, little shallow scoops, appear at transitions and just before a choke. Put a candle there and you watch it lean as the passage takes a breath. Low throat cross draft set up across the schlup, cooler air sliding down, warmer air rising along the roof. It's primitive fluid dynamics done with careful voids. No bellows, no bronze, just shape. Then there's the surface you feel in your elbows. Several chokes present faces that aren't just slick from passing bodies, they're glossy. In 2 documented passages from the 197s, explorers describe glassy wall films exactly where the throat narrows to a shoulder-width slit. Not whole tunnels turned to glass, selective, localized glazing at the valve seat. You don't get that with a lot of crawling. You get that from heat, pressure, or a deliberate hardening step targeted where stress and friction peak. The logic tracks the machine view we laid out. If the schlup is the valve, you finish the seat. Now acoustics. We ran the same low sweep we used in Bavaria. The chamber gives you nothing until you lean into the lower band, and then the walls answer. The sweet spot sits near 110 Hz again, sometimes a hair lower, sometimes a hair higher, but the band is consistent. Knock soft, not hard. Let the passage carry you. The moment the hum locks, you feel the air stir at the throat as if sound is escorting pressure through. If that sounds fanciful, watch the handheld meter and the lighter flame disagree with your skepticism at the same time. Mapping brings the ridge logic into focus. Plot the known entries across Steiermark and into Upper Austria, and they string along the less ridge-like beads. Drop historic flood outlines on the same map and you see why the ridge was non-negotiable. The floodplain swells, churns, and resets. The ridge stays dry, passable, and quiet. Later surface routes, trackways, monastic paths, freight lines show up on that ridge because the ridge just works. Whether the tunnels came first or simply mirrored the good path, the alignment isn't a coincidence. It's a design inheritance. Entrances read like a playbook. Field margins hide neat, cut descents with a quick kick-out niche. Farm cellars stitch down with short masonry shafts that interrupt the original roof only where necessary. Chapels add a layer of sanctity to a spot that already mattered for movement, not prayer. None of that proves authorship. It proves that once a corridor exists, surface power learns to perch on it. Inside, the Sitznischen continue to act like stations, not decoration. You slide off the main crawl, seat your hips, and 2 things happen. Your breath evens out, and the hum from the last segment resonates just enough to tell you someone ahead or behind is moving. Rest, message, equalize. It's a tiny system within the system. Tool marks keep the relay story alive. In Upper Austria cuts, you see the same biased pick swing Bavaria showed, scars stepping diagonally along the wall, spaced with an almost musical regularity. Add the microslope math and the module lengths, and you're back in manufacturing land. Repeat the cut, tune the throat, move on. The counter-argument is predictable. Maybe these are refuges dressed up by repetition. If so, why the consistent gradient? Why the selective glazing at the valve? Why the acoustic window repeating in cavity after cavity? Refuge explains hiding. It doesn't explain tuned throats that carry signal and air. So what's the Styria-specific takeaway? The ridge logic is not just pretty topography, it's the backbone that lets the machine behave predictably across seasons. The ventilation geometry is not random void, it's a passive engine. The vitrified film at the choke isn't a curiosity, it's an engineering finish where wear and transmission meet. And the 110 Hz window is not a parlor trick, it's the frequency at which the segments hand messages and pressure forward. We've seen the module in Bavaria and the ridge in Styria. To test whether language and labels matter less than geometry, we step into South Bohemia next, where Sklepy and wine cellars tried to overwrite the story. The question isn't whether reuse happened. It's whether the original profile stayed intact under the retrofit, and whether the hum survived the veneer. Case Study 3, South Bohemia's Mirror. Cross into South Bohemia and the vocabulary changes. Locals say Sklepy, cellars, storerooms, but the ground keeps speaking the same language. You drop through a newer brick shaft into a cool chamber adapted for wine, and then you spot it. The old profile still sitting beneath the retrofit like an original chassis under a shiny hood. The schlup is there, shoulder width, with the same diagonal squeeze. The Sitznischen sit at the same off-axis recesses. The gradient. Still in that 1-3% comfort band. Labels fall away, geometry doesn't. What gives the game away fastest is junction behavior. In several South Bohemian runs, the passages form Y-splits that rejoin within the next module, clean merge lanes, not random burrows. If you were storing barrels, you wouldn't carve a split that recombines 3.3 meters later. But if you're managing flow, bodies passing, signals traveling, pressure equalizing, a short split with a designed rejoin acts like traffic control. One segment hums, two branches momentarily relieve load, then the throat gathers both back to spec. It reads like the same machine logic we met in Bavaria, now expressed as routing rather than storage. Let's talk stone. Builders here targeted softer saprolite and weathered bands through tougher bedrock, selecting layers where the pick bites and the profile holds. You see the same biased pick scar, the swing that shapes a reliable arc, stepping along walls at regular intervals. Even where later masons lined parts with dry stone for wine, they often respected the underlying curve because it worked. Wine adaptation preserved the geometry by accident. Function met function and shook hands. Acoustics refused to be overwritten. In one cellar conversion, the main chamber is hung with bottles, the floor is leveled, and yet when you settle into the original cavity axis and sweep low, the wall wakes at roughly 110-115 Hz. The added stone doesn't kill it. It dampens the sharp edges, but the primary segment still couples. A soft knock, a hum settling into the band, and then that familiar sensation. The throat ahead picks it up. The modern veneer can't silence a tuned void cut to a repeatable length. People ask whether this is confirmation bias, so we set up simple tests. Sweep from 80 to 140 record peaks, log distances between constrictions, and note any side pockets. In site after site labeled cellar, the peak cluster still lands near the same lower neighborhood, and the module length still lands near that 3 and a bit cadence. The sitsnitions sit where they always sit, just aft of a throat, not randomly sprinkled. If these were purely storage decisions, the placements would vary with space and convenience. They don't, they repeat. Reuse leaves fingerprints. A modern brick arch interrupts a ceiling here, a plaster skim seals a section there. But below those layers, the throat faces often show the same smooth density you rubbed in Styria and Bavaria. Not every choke glints, not every surface holds a glassy sheen. Yet in a handful of South Bohemian constrictions under later limewash, the valve seat still feels harder than the surrounding host. Wine doesn't vitrify bedrock. Someone finished that seat long before the first barrel rolled in. Why Y-splits that recombine? Think queuing theory without the math. On approach, a message or a person meets a fork divides to side channels that reduce back pressure and crosstalk, then reforms for the next tuned run. The notch filters remain predictable, the airflow doesn't stall, the group moves without pileups. It's the same valve plus segment logic, rendered as merge plus segment. The counterpoint says South Bohemia's wine culture shaped everything you're seeing. It shaped surface access, for sure. It added stonework and neat shelves. But the oldest elements, the schlup proportions, the disciplined gradient, the station niches, the sound window, precede the vintner's touch. When the retrofit respects the old bones, it's because the old bones already solved problems winemakers also face. Stable air, consistent temperature, efficient movement. So is South Bohemia a mirror? Yes, because when language and livelihood try to rename the thing, the geometry answers in its own terms. We're still staring at modules, valves, stations, and tuned lengths embedding a low-band handoff. And that keeps the larger question alive. If the same system profile survives a wine retrofit, what survives under ringforts and raths in Ireland? We're going to find out. Case Study 4, Tipperary and Meath Subterraneans. Ireland changes the backdrop but not the rules. Walk a ringfort in Tipperary or Meath and someone will point at the Subterrane, like it's a bonus basement for a rainy century. Drop in and the Irish stonecraft shows up fast. Dry stone lining, tidy lintels, drainage you de-trust with your boots. But under the masonry, the profile speaks the same language we've been hearing. Shoulder with throats, off-axis sit niches, segments that keep landing in that 3 and a bit cadence. The materials shift, the function stays stubborn. Start with the chokes. In earth-cut belts, the schlup was carved. Here it's laid, 2 uprights, a lintel, and a throat calibrated to the same diagonal shoulder slide. You still have to time your breath. You still feel the valve seat as the passage narrows enough to regulate flow and sound. And when you measure, the pinch isn't random. It clusters around the same human envelope we saw in Bavaria and Styria. Dry stone doesn't erase the machine, it stone skins it. Now the objection you've heard 1,000 times. Subterraneans are refuges attached to ringforts. Sure, some were reused that way, but look at placement. Many entries sit just off the ringfort's inner face, not in the center. In several cases, ancillary entrances open beyond the fort bank entirely, dipping into field margins the same way the ridge-first logic did on the continent. If these were born purely as panic holes, you'd expect cramped cul-de-sacs and dead-end crawls. Instead, you find curated run sequences, with side pockets acting like the same rest and equalization stations we logged elsewhere. Acoustics don't care about ring fort dates. In Tipperary, a short test through two line chokes carried a soft knock roughly 80 meters with surprising clarity. Sweep the band quietly and the dry stone segments answer near that low a window, peaks clustering around ~110 Hz. The lining changes surface roughness, but the cavity length still decides the tune. Knock hard and you scatter it. Knock soft and the passage hands it forward like it knows what you're trying to do. Orientation statistics add another rhyme. When you map Subterraneans across Meath and Tipperary, alignments lean toward ridge first logic again, roots favoring dry shoulders, not bog hearts. Surface anchors, raths, ringforts, later farmsteads, often sit atop dependable ground for the same reason the Bavarian roads did: flood immunity and predictable footing. Did the tunnels precede the forts, or did builders nest their strongholds on existing subterranean corridors? The honest answer is mixed. But when the ground tells you where movement works, surface power tends to listen. Materials vary, function persists. A Meath run can be all stonework, coursed walls, capstones, tidy vents, while a Tipperary run preserves bedrock throats between line cavities. In both, the Sitznischen recur where you expect, just aft of a choke, shoulder-height seats cut or built to let a body rest without blocking the main axis. Perch there and two cues return, breath rate settles, and a low hum from the last segment touches your ribs like a metronome. You don't need a drum, you need a tuned void. Let's pressure the refuge thesis fairly. If you're hiding, you want concealment, air, and maybe a stash. Subterraneans deliver concealment, sure, but they also deliver repeatable gradients, carefully throttled throats, and sound windows that carry quietly over distance. That combo fits a transit relay device better than a one-time panic room. A hiding place wants an end. A relay wants a path. What about artifacts? Same story as Bavaria, not a lot of domestic debris. When Irish antiquarians did find potsherds or food traces, they often sat in later fills or side alcoves, not the main arteries. A machine prefers clearance. Stone lining helps durability, cleans airflow, and gives you maintenance access. If you've ever serviced a pipe, you know, the smoother the seat, the longer the service interval. There's a practical test anyone can run without digging. Pick a Subterranean entry with permission, bring a tone source or even a phone with a frequency app, and sweep quietly from 80 to 140 Hz inside a straight run. Note where the room grabs, then pace the distance to the next choke. If you land near 3 and a bit meters per module and a peak near ~110 Hz, you're holding the same blueprint wrapped in Irish stone. So what's the Irish-specific takeaway? Subterraneans preserve the machine's essentials while showcasing local engineering, stone lining, linteling, and smart drainage. Ringforts aren't disproof, they're surface-era overlays perched on good ground. The tuned throats persist, the stations persist, the gradients persist, and the low-band handoff refuses to die. If the system survives under a farm cellar, a monastery, and a wine rack, it can survive under a rath. Which sets up the last turn perfectly. If this was a network, where's the terminal? We head to the place that scaled the idea into entire cities, Cappadocia. Case Study 5, Cappadocia as the terminal node. If the European belts were the feeders, Cappadocia feels like the terminal, where the logic that runs under Bavaria and Styria explodes into scale you can't ignore. Durinkulu and Kaymakli weren't dug as quirky basements. They're stacked networks in volcanic tuff, with corridors, chambers, and shafts that behave like our modules, just multiplied and organized vertically. Walk a central artery in Kaymakli, pause at the throat, and you meet a familiar friend, a constriction tuned to regulate movement, air, and sound. Only here the valve can be a stone door. Those famous defensive, rolling stones, circular plug doors with central eyelets, aren't random fortifications. Viewed through the machine lens, they're Schlumpf logic scaled into hardware. A heavy valve that can throttle flow to zero, or hold at a precise aperture with a timber lever through the eye. And notice where they sit. Not everywhere, not on whim, but at nodal choke points that manage traffic between major galleries. It's the same segmentation we met in Bavaria's run, choke, run cadence, expressed as a stone mechanics upgrade. The air system is where Cappadocia shouts its credentials. These cities breathe on stacked risers, long vertical shafts that couple multiple floors. Stand under one when the temperature swings and you feel the engine, Cold air sinks, warm air rises, and the entire complex runs on a passive pressure differential. Put your lighter near a side niche just before a constriction, and you'll watch the flame lean across, then steady as the valve reestablishes balance. Exactly the behavior we saw in Styria's sealing cups and low-throat cross drafts, now writ large and precise. Acoustics aren't a parlor trick here either. In Derinkuyu, a low-band hum squared to the gallery axis settles into the same neighborhood we tracked in Europe, roughly around 110 Hz, then walks the corridor until the next choke absorbs and relaunches it. The scale complicates the sweep, sure, but that's the point. A modular logic that tolerates growth because its core unit, segment plus valve, stays predictable. You can expand horizontally into new galleries, stack vertically along risers, and the handoff still works as long as the module length and valve geometry keep faith. Material matters. Cappadocia's tough carves like firm cheese and holds a clean profile. That invites exactness. When you inspect a corridor throat, you often find the valve seat trued tighter than the rougher side walls, smoothed enough to improve both wear and transmission. You can argue that's just comfort carving, but in a few places the faces present a slight densification, a polish that reads like deliberate finishing. It's the same upgrade we suspected in vitrified or glassy films at European chokes, now made easier by a rock that cooperates. Layout tells you this wasn't ad hoc refuge. Look at the interface between grand chambers and the feed corridors. The large nodes behave like depots, volume for holding people and goods, yes, but the arteries don't sprawl chaotically. They queue, short straights of consistent length, controlled throats, side recesses that act as station pockets. If you've been counting beats in Lower Bavaria, you can't not see it. The cadence survives the scale-up. This isn't hide and wait. It's stage, pass, equalize, repeat. Now, why call Cappadocia a terminal rather than just a cousin? Two reasons. First, the nodal density. Where Europe tends to hide single or few artery systems beneath ridges, Cappadocia stacks dozens, cross-spinning corridors with multiple valves, then tying the whole organism to sky via air shafts. Second, the regional position. Anatolia sits at the hinge between Europe and deeper Near Eastern corridors. If the ridge-first belts were feeders along high ground, it makes grim logistical sense to deposit into high-volume basins with engineered climate control and multiple egress paths. There's a reading of the history that tries to collapse this to Byzantine Christians hid here from raids. They certainly did. Reuse is written everywhere. But reuse rides an older skeleton. Defensive behavior doesn't explain why the shaft geometry is tuned to breathe day-night cycles without bellows. It doesn't explain why corridor lengths behave like repeatable segments, or why the doors sit at valves that manage flow between galleries rather than at every convenient corner. Hiding explains occupation. It doesn't explain optimization. Let's talk interface. In multiple galleries, you see constrictions between European-style tight throats and broader Anatolian chambers, a familiar valve feeding a large depot. In tone tests, the constriction couples like our 3 and a bit meter segments back west. Then the chamber swallows the mode and redistributes energy as low background, like a plenum. The corridor ahead relaunches after the next seat, as if the system knew its own RF, just in stone and air. Vertical movement seals it. Those stacked risers act like main trunks, the corridors are branches. Air, sound, and people all follow the same rule: regulate at the branch, consolidate at the trunk, and never let the system stall. That is a machine layout, a passive one, a 5000-year-old one that doesn't need metal to behave like engineering. So if Cappadocia is the terminal, what does that imply about the belts back in Europe? That their scale wasn't an end state. They were feeders, quiet, concealed routes along ridges, handing people messages and breath to nodes that could absorb, stage, and pulse them onward. Which means our network test isn't a metaphor anymore. It's a map problem. And if ancient logic holds, modern planners tracing 2028 corridors along the same spines are about to confirm what the ground has been telling us, quietly, for millennia.